Maybe it's time, so maybe we'll get started. So this is the obviously the second installment in our series. Of kind of a broad, not too deep overview of the history of psychoanalysis, really situating not just thinking about the history of psychoanalysis, but also trying to a little bit more specifically about how this history, what elements of this history have specific relevance for us at RIGS. And so today we're going to be talking about Sandor Ferenczi and the Hungarian or Budapest School of Psychoanalysis. So, and just to start to say something about, so we'll cover Ferenczi, Balint, touch on Herman, and then think a little bit about some of the Hungarians that we don't necessarily think of as identified with the Hungarian school, but who carry specifically pieces of Ferenczi with them into the work, and then how that has influenced us now. So Ferenczi was born in 1873, died in 1933 of pernicious anemia, so at a fairly young age. And he, some of his monikers, he was described often as the enfant terrible of psychoanalysis. So he was a real provocateur, and he was pushing a lot of buttons and stretching things to their limit, and having success in that in a way that a number of other people who were pushing limits around that time. Yes.
Because we're filming you, you've got the light on you from the
Okay, there we
screen.
go.
If you could just move over.
Yes.
Perfect.
So, a lot of other psychoanalysts didn't survive within the body of psychoanalysis while they were pushing those limits. He was also regarded as the psychoanalyst of last resort, which actually I think is very important in the context of the kind of work that we're doing as a place where our patients often think of this place as a place of last resort. So he was born in Hungary, but he was from a Polish Jewish family, a large family with 12 kids. He was the eighth. And in the context of what was happening in Eastern Europe, modularized the family name from Frankel to Ferenczi as part of an effort to assimilate better. He grew up in a very vibrant, intellectually vibrant community. His father was a publisher and bookseller, and so there's a lot of thinking that was gathering around the Ferenczi household. But his father died when he was 15. He was still fairly young. And this is hypothesized to be a source of kind of father hunger that drew him to Freud, but then which also became a source of conflict and disappointment. Now, the relationship between Freud and Ferenczi is an interesting and important one. So they met in 1908. And it was right away, there was a connection, and very shortly after that, Ferenczi was moved into the inner circle of psychoanalysis. He was one of the first analysts to receive a training analysis by Freud. Freud analyzed a lot of people, but this was a formal training analysis. They had correspondence over the years of over 1,200 letters. Ferenczi was the one who proposed we should have an international psychoanalytic association, which then got taken up, and Ferenczi served as its third president. And he was a member of the secret committee. So this was the small group of psychoanalysts who were unofficially but secretly charged with protecting some kind of purity of psychoanalysis from the kinds of things that like Jung was doing and all that. And Ferenczi founded the Hungarian or the Budapest Psychoanalytic Society, and it had a very different feel than the one in Vienna. As Eva Brabant, who was one of the psychoanalysts of the time, noted that the paternalistic style of the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society was unknown in Budapest, where professional connections doubled up with ties of friendship. And I think this says something about the more relaxed way that Ferenczi worked with the people around him. Ferenczi was testing these boundaries in large measure, certainly early on. Freud found it interesting, and he was bringing some of this stuff into his own work. But as Ferenczi got a little bit more interested in relaxation and ways of indulging the patient, you started to get a little bit more conflict. And then at the very end of his career, the last big paper that Ferenczi gave on the confusion of tongues paper represented much more of a break between them. And Freud had his complaints about Ferenczi. Ferenczi complained back that, well, on this conflict is because my analysis with you was not complete. And so there was some degree of tension. And as a result of that, as you'll hear, Ferenczi kind of drops out of the mind of psychoanalysis for a while. Now, this is happening in the context of a lot of, important historical events. So Budapest was really a hotbed of thinking and creativity in the beginning of the 20th century. The 1918 revolution brought a reformer, Bela Kun, to power, and there was a lot of energy. The students were really excited. In this case, the students wanted psychoanalysis in the university, and so as part of their progressive reforms, and so demanded this, and that resulted in the very first tenured position in psychoanalysis in a university being developed at the Budapest School of Medicine, where Ferenczi became the first appointed professor of psychoanalysis in the world. This sparked, and in ways that seem a little bit reminiscent of where we are today, sparked a counter-revolution, a Romanian-backed counter-revolution, where joined in large measure by a lot of people in the countryside who felt that all those reforms were benefiting the people in the cities, but they're not helping us at all. And so a proto-fascist government deposed or took the Bela Kun government out of power. And it was, this is a proto-Nazi government as well. So a lot of anti-Semitism. They were creating laws to prevent Jews from having influence in academia, for Jews to have academic positions. The secret police were attending all of psychoanalytic lectures, trying to figure out who these dirty Jewish dissidents were, or people who were being influenced by them, which really had a very stifling effect. And a lot of trainees fled to Berlin. Now, the school that was developing, just to say, just some big grand summary of kind of the things that they were thinking about and what distinguished the Hungarian school. And then what I'm going to do is just, I think, walk through some of the papers following the development of that thinking. So the Hungarian school was characterized by clinical innovation and experimentation. These were a group of people who were working and thinking outside the box. The focus was shifting to some extent from the Oedipal to the pre-Oedipal, the first 3 years. Focus on trauma, dissociation, and re-traumatization. These are all things, of course, that you recognize from modern psychoanalysis. And we'll talk about how they got folded in. Focus on the therapeutic relationship in a different way as a relationship. And the specific needs of treatment-resistant patients. And Ferenczi shaped a generation of psychoanalysts. And I think in a way, the oppression that was happening that kept sending waves of psychoanalysts away from Hungary contributed, I think, to that getting out into the world more than it might have. So the first wave, a bunch of people went to Berlin, maybe some to Vienna, but mostly Berlin. And so his thinking was brought there. And then when the Nazis came to power, and as there was a second spreading out, people came to the United States and especially England. And so it spread his ideas, though in a way that people were often not really crediting Ferenczi because he was a bit on the outs, and we'll talk about how that happened. So some of the people in that Some of the Hungarians that went out and had influence included, of course, Sándor Ferenczi, Michael Balint, Imre Hermann, and I'm going to talk mostly about these three, but Géza Roem, who was more was more thinking about cultural issues, Sándor Rado, and then some Hungarians who, again, were influenced by Ferenczi, but you would never think of them as members of the Hungarian School. So Melanie Klein, Franz Alexander, and Margaret Mahler. So Ferenczi, of course, has this reputation as the analyst of last resort. And really what he's doing, and speaks to the relevance for us, he is thinking about those patients specifically who are not responding to psychoanalysis as usual. Patients who are not getting better, who are bogged down in impasses, and trying to think, well, what do you do when that happens? And though he's not thought, we don't think of him as necessarily as part of the what came to be called in the 50s the widening scope of psychoanalysis. He was one of the people who was working on this. Now, for the next few slides, we're going to think about where we were in terms of like classical Freudian thinking, and then what Ferenczi was doing with that kind of moved things in a different direction. So, of course, the classical psychoanalytic position is one of non-involvement, but in 1920, Ferenczi writes his paper on active therapy and psychoanalysis. And as Ferenczi says, psychoanalysis as we practice it today is a procedure whose most prominent characteristic is passivity. Basically, the one way the analyst involves him or herself in the patient's life in a way that's a bit of choosing sides is by giving the fundamental rule. This is the thing you should do, is say what comes to mind. But beyond that, I'm going to get out of your way and just interpret. And that's the main activity, is interpreting, not from a position of neutrality, not telling the patient what they should do, but more telling the patient what they are doing. And then as they become conscious of that, that gives them some choice. But Ferenczi notices that doesn't work for everybody. A lot of people are bogged down, they're stuck, they're not moving. So he starts to experiment with the active technique, right? And the active technique involves, from his perspective, encouraging or prohibiting behaviors. You should do this, you shouldn't do this. And not you should do this in the sense that early psychoanalysis was working at catharsis. You do this, you let something out, but rather the point being kind of the opposite. Rather than letting something out and letting the tension down, he's doing this in a way that is ratcheting up the tension. The thing you can't stand to do, he says you should do that. You know, a bit like CBT. So one example that he wrote about a number of times was like he has an inhibited singer, and he says you must sing for me, and then plumbing that, like, what are your reactions? What comes up? And starting to by putting them in that spot of increased tension, trying to learn something about the nature of the inhibition. Now, in a situation like this might be a situation where once the patient overcomes their anxiety about their exhibitionism, and like it becomes now the exhibition is out the box. Ferenczi might say, now you need to stop doing that, and then learn about like what's the what happens then when we restrain that anxiety. And so he is using this as a way of helping the patient move when they've been kind of stuck. And this might also involve challenges to the misuse of the fundamental rule, the patient saying what's on their mind, but he detects, oh, there's something you were almost about to say and you didn't say it. Tell me what you were thinking. So we're not going to follow that train of thought. We're going to stick with what just went underground. Or setting an end date for treatment for those who he says cling to treatment instead of to reality. And this was something that Otto Rank was also experimenting with at the time. Ferenczi reported successes with this, but by 1926, he decided to abandon the active technique. Largely because he felt that pressure on the patient really had the potential to be re-traumatizing, to tap into early childhood traumas, which he didn't want to do. And he also began to understand that resistance wasn't just intrapsychic. Resistance was also related. The patient may have, when you are in that spot, it evokes, the patient has reasons to resist besides just, I don't want to admit this into consciousness. They're resisting your authoritarianism or something like that. So he moved basically in a totally opposite direction by 1926. Freud was much more focused on fathers and Oedipal development. And I was this many years old when I really understood that when Freud was talking about the oceanic feeling, he was not talking about a return to the womb, which I had always assumed because a number of post-Freudian writers, Ronk and people like that, thought of the oceanic feeling as that. But for Freud, it was not that. For Freud, the oceanic feeling had to do with being protected by, having a God figure that was like a father figure that protected you. And Freud says in 1930, in Civilization and Its Discontents, I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. This is all about the father. And of course, the Oedipus complex is the crucible of development, the way the child contends with the father and then internalizes the father in the resolution of the Oedipus complex. And Ferenczi is starting to move the Hungarian school in a very different direction with a focus on the maternal, the pre-Oedipal, pre-verbal. His book, Thalassa in 1924, really is about how much he sees this as a primary longing for a return to a kind of primal union. And even our sexual activity, our genitality is in large measure about that seeking of a union with the maternal body in a way. He also is beginning to think about how pre-Oedipal injuries are formative for us, and the body becomes a site of unconscious memory, which these are things he's developing now over the next 9 years before his death. Now, in his papers on technique, in the 3 or 4 year period between 1912 and 1914 or 15, Freud lays out a lot of the basic principles, abstinence, neutrality, surgeon-like dispassion, etc. Now, Ferenczi interprets this not as a prescription, but as a proscription. So he says basically, Freud is telling us what not to do. That leaves us a lot of room to figure out what we can do. So he thinks of this as really giving analysts a lot of wiggle room for experimentation, although not a lot of people who did not take it that way. And so he argued for what he called an elasticity of technique, where the analyst is doing much more of adapting to the patient's needs. How do we know how to adapt to the patient's needs? Ferenczi says the key is a kind of empathy and tact, which guides rather than interferes with analysis. Now, this is super important, right? Because this is the beginning of an introduction into psychoanalysis, so an idea of a two-person psychology, of a turning of attention, of the analyst's attention inwards to understand something about what is happening with the patient. And so this just is a very important beginning of a turn towards something which is now very familiar and claimed by the relational school, et cetera, and lots of people from the 50s on. So he's beginning this kind of thinking. He also is highlighting in this, just from his perspective, the absolute importance of frankness and honesty. And again, you hear how this starts to fold into the relational school and our sharing things with our patients from our experience that are intended to help them. So, he says that the acquisition of a more than Christian humility is one of the hardest tasks of psychoanalytic practice. We're supposed to, have that kind of neutrality, no expectation, interest. And he says that one of the things, because we fall short of that, we end up being deceptive with our patients. Oh yeah, I'm not mad, carrying ourselves as if we're not having these reactions. And Ferenczi said one must never be ashamed unreservedly to confess one's own mistakes. And he says otherwise, the analysts, they sense it and they cannot trust us. So when we mess up, we have to find a way to own that, which is not the way Freud, Freud, of course, Freud would not subject himself to analysis. Both Jung and Ferenczi had offered to analyze him. He would not subject himself to that because he felt like to give that kind of, give people a chance to see where the sausages get made will deprive him of his authority. So this is, again, a very different, Ferenczi embodies this in a very different way than Freud did. And Ferenczi is starting to think about, what happens in analysis. For Freud, of course, this is about insight. And once he abandons the cathartic method, where you let it out, and now you're all that pent-up drive energy is out, and now it doesn't have to find its, circuitous paths through symptoms. And the shift is change occurs through insight. The task is to make the unconscious conscious. Transference, really, the interesting thing about transference is how it becomes a vehicle of repetition that allows the patient to then develop insight about what their deeper drives are, what they're looking for. Whereas for Ferenczi, in the book he co-authored with Otto Rank, The Development of Psychoanalysis, he starts talking really about how the experience of the analyst is itself a vehicle of change. Right? Independent of what we tell the patient, independent of what they are knowing consciously, but something is happening between doctor and patient that is change promoting. And he says, and particularly for those who have had early developmental traumas or experiences with caregiving that has undermined the capacity to trust. But it's a bit of a two-way street, because he's now also beginning to think about how the analyst sits with the patient, and it can not only be a vehicle of change, positive change, but also a vehicle for repetition of the original trauma. And this recognition, really, you'll see how it shapes the rest of his thinking. For Freud, of course, the infant is voraciously libidinous. And I think in the thinking of the time, the general thinking was that the life force was going to be greatest at the beginning of life. The appetites, the growth, the explosion. Though Freud would recognize there were constitutional differences among people. So some had a constitutionally stronger life force, others had a constitutionally weaker life force. But Ferenczi, in his paper on the unwelcome child and his death instinct, is thinking about this very differently. In Ferenczi's way of thinking, actually, the death instinct is greatest at the beginning of life. And this is because you are just inches from non-being. So there is that longing for non-being. And in Ferenczi's view, he says the child has to be induced through an immense expenditure of love, tenderness, and care to forgive his parents for having brought him into the world. Right? So the child needs in order, as Ferenczi says, children who are received in a harsh and disagreeable way die easily and willingly. And that if they escape this fate, they do not die in childhood. They keep a streak of pessimism and aversion to life. So he's saying something about something, he's beginning to articulate something that has to happen in the first couple of years of life to counter that predominant death instinct and to bring to life in this child a will to live. It depends on what the parents do. This is not about constitution. This is about something that happens in the context of actual parenting. And in his paper, The Unwelcome Child, he's beginning to flesh out these ideas around developmental trauma, the thing that doesn't happen, that is in itself a trauma. Trauma is not just, that something terrible happens to you, which of course psychoanalysis is spending a lot of time also denying that terrible things are happening to you, but that it's also about things that do not happen. And for these patients, Ferenczi says, and then one of the ways, so Ferenczi is doing this, and of course all of it is like rubbing, clashing a bit with what Freud is doing. He is over and over and over again making the point that this is just for those patients who are not able to make good use of it. So he's not trying to undermine the way that Freud was proposing to work. He was saying sometimes that doesn't work, and then you need other things. So I think it's partly how he's able to escape the fate of Jung and Adler and other people. With regard to the active technique, which was first of these innovations, he compared it to the use of forceps. But you don't pull the forceps out right away. You want to see if the natural way of doing it is going to work, and if not, then you gotta start pulling. And so this is the way he talked about it over the course of these papers. And he says these patients who have this tenuous grasp on life, the patient had to be allowed for a time to have his way like a child, permitted, properly speaking for the first time, the child didn't have this experience in their actual growing up, for the first time to enjoy the irresponsibility of childhood, which is equivalent to the introduction of positive life impulses and motives for his subsequent existence. So to create a space where there's, a feeling of love, a feeling of play, all those things that bring us to life as children. Again, all this keeps, each paper he develops all these things a bit further. And Freud says, of course, the treatment is to be carried out in abstinence. Transference love and everywhere else. And it is actually, from Freud's perspective, the experience of the analyst's non-involvement that heightens desire and tension and becomes the drive through which the patient gets better. It highlights transferences, but Freud says, when Freud says psychoanalysis is the cure through love, he does not mean that it is the analyst's love that cures the patient. What he means is that deprivation motivates the patient to try to win the analyst's love, and makes them do the hard work of therapy. It's the thing that makes them be willing to overcome their resistances. And Freud says if you don't do that, if you gratify the patient, then the patient will have achieved her goal, but the analyst will not have achieved his. Ferenczi, again, is looking at this from a very different perspective. For Ferenczi, the risk is especially for these kinds of patients who've been, so deprived and have these developmental traumas, the abstinent analyst repeats the childhood trauma. So in many ways, it can make the problems worse. The patient's defenses, Ferenczi says, were developed to cope with parental insincerity, and will continue to cope with the analyst's insincerity. And what these patients need is love and acceptance and sincerity from the analyst. So a very different way of working. An earnest and caring atmosphere, which instead of heightening tensions, reduces them, and the patients are able to relax. This is in this paper, the principle of relaxation and neocatharsis is where Ferenczi starts to pay attention to the links between child analysis and adult analysis, and to propose that for some of our patients, the differences should not be so big. And Ferenczi says, and benefits, there are real benefits. Under the method of relaxation, the hysterical physical symptoms have at times fed us back to phases of development in which, since the organ of thought was not yet completely developed, physical memories alone were registered. So he's starting to think about some of the more contemporary ways we think about trauma as registered, at least in the pre-verbal phase, as registered in the body with no conscious memory. And Ferenczi says, if you want to get to that, you have to let the patient relax and trust and feel safe enough that they can start to let the body show what the story is. Again, very different from the way Freud was thinking. And Ferenczi says in this paper, possibly the analytic sanatorium treatment recommended by Simmel might be developed with special reference to these cases. So again, he's pointing to us, right? He's saying these patients, the whole environment becomes a safe kind of play space where they're cared for enough that they can begin to relax. And of course, that's part of our experience is patients often cannot relax enough to really settle into treatment, really settle in to telling the story without the overwhelming offer of a place like this to care for them while they are doing that really difficult work. And Freud, Freud's somewhat critical. Freud's starting to get more critical. He derides this innovation as Ferenczi's kissing technique. Now, this is true, right? So Clara Thompson, who was analyzed by Ferenczi, came back stateside, part of the intersubjective school, part of the foundation of the William Allinson White. She said, Papa Ferenczi would let me kiss him whenever I want, right? So, and this gets back to Freud and becomes, and he would be, the patients would be in crisis. He would put a hand on their head. He would, so he is really stretching the boundaries here, and starting to get more suspicion from Freud than he was getting before. He's making this link more explicitly in his paper on child analysis and the analysis of adults, right? Where Freud says treatment occurs in language, and Ferenczi is starting to highlight the importance of regression and play. For again, maybe not for your high-level neurotic patients, but for our patients who are more deeply disturbed, that these patients do need an analysis that looks much more like child analysis. So instead of symbolization in language and frustration as the driver of development, it's very clear, that not everything for these patients can be symbolized in language, especially where developmental traumas result in a dissociation of the self. And so now he's beginning to develop a theory of dissociation, the ways that traumas create a kind of a break in the patient where their pieces are not at all integrated, where there may be a horribly tortured piece that is all affect, and then a piece that knows the story and has language, but is totally disconnected from what the affect is. And these patients, you may not be able to put those pieces together without creating a space, a play space for the patient to be able to relax. And he starts to talk about the analyst needing to be a tender mother to these patients, where the patient feels the contrast between our behavior as analysts and that which he experienced in his real family, and knowing himself safe from the repetition of such situations, he has the courage to let himself sink down into a reproduction of the painful past. And we get here genuine insights into the way in which special bodily sites are selected for symptom expression. So as this is happening, you're seeing in real time, like where things are showing up in the patient's body and starting to be able to reconstruct the story from that. Now this is not without limits. This is not like there are so important to say, Ferenczi would say, I would never let an analytic hour pass though without thoroughly analyzing the material acquired from the enactment. So it's not just a big play space without any thinking. And he highlights that frustration is sure to come, either through the ordinary failings of the analyst, or maybe a point at which the analyst starts to feel that this patient could hang out in this play space forever. It's so gratifying, and then starts to feel like, I have to start us moving out of this into something else. John Rickman said, well, when you're doing that, don't you have to have measures at hand, because the patient is really going to be enraged and flip out? And Ferenczi says, yes, I do, but I've never had to use them. A hand on the head, holding their hand, just a brief moment of that is usually enough to restore them to so they're not a danger to themselves or me. And Ferenczi also says the patient is acting out in a way, if he drops his role in the game, because there will be a game, there will be a playing quality, the patient speaking in a whisper, and Ferenczi answers in a whisper, and it does have a quality of a game. But if the patient drops his role in the game and sets himself to act out infantile reality in terms of adult behavior, overt sexualization, the threat of violence from an adult, it must be shown to the patient that it is he who's spoiling the game. Right? We can't play if you're going to take the game, act out the game as an adult. Now, then in 1933, Ferenczi delivers his paper on the confusion of tongues between adults and the child, which was the passion, the language of tenderness and passion. And of course, for Freud, kind of a bedrock, right, of psychosexual theory, pushes him into a position where he is thinking of all of these reports of seduction as fantasy, and Freud, and as opposed to Ferenczi, who's taking these things as reality. In his paper on, and he adds in his paper on child analysis and the analysis of adults, when there is a trauma, he also notices that it is often not just the trauma, but the denial of the caregiving figure who should say, what the hell, that makes the trauma pathogenic. Right? So he is always, so before this, he's starting to pay attention to the ways that we may participate in harming the patient, in doing what psychoanalysis is doing. So for Freud, though, this hinges right on the whole concept of infantile sexuality. The child is sexual from birth. They desire the opposite sex parent. They fantasize like possessing the parent and in some infantile form, some sexual contact where the parent is theirs. Now, for Freud, of course, psychic reality trumps actual reality. In the primary process, there's no difference. If you imagine it, it's real, right? And so what Freud is saying is, yeah, this is largely just evidence of the power of the sexual drive of the child, right? That they are remembering these fantasies of abuse, which are actually just infantile wish fulfillments. And that so what you do is rather than taking this as reality, therapy is aimed at uncovering the unconscious conflicts that put the child in that position of remembering it of wanting that, remembering it that way, and the child owning their forbidden libidinous drives, rather than our task being to recover actual factual memories. Now, Ferenczi in this paper really is making a much stronger point that rape of children is much more common than believed, and he points to various evidence, including the adult adolescents who are reporting they are sexually abusing children, right? And so Ferenczi is saying like, why this is a problem. Now I should say when he was going to deliver this paper at the 12th International Conference in Wiesbaden, Freud said, don't give this paper. But Ferenczi thought it was important. And the way Ferenczi understood this is there's what he called the confusion of tongues, where the child in their innocence and their desire for tenderness, approaches the adult lovingly, tenderly, playfully, and the adult is confused about what language the child is speaking and meets the child's language of tenderness with a language of adult passion and thinks, oh, this is an invitation to sex with this child. And then the child, of course, is an overwhelming experience, of course. Child responds, becoming almost an automaton, a dissociative kind of paralysis. Again, the adult thinks, oh, there's no objection here. And then the kind of he's developing a modern understanding of dissociation in the context of severe trauma. And the child, and the more this happens, the more the child fragments, and Ferenczi is articulating, is talking about patients who literally are in pieces, and each piece has its own personality, and the pieces are not talking to each other. So he's talking. This is one of the first places where we're talking about what becomes dissociative identity disorder. But the other thing the child does to cope is a kind of an identification with the aggressor. So either becoming sexualized, or the other thing that the adults may often do is rather than facing what they've done, they blame the child, they try to protect the child with a kind of a harshness, and then the child is internalizing that harsh cruelty. And then this becomes the nidus of a crushing guilt about, oh, this is all my fault. Right? So the child takes it all on themselves, even though obviously that's not the story. And Ferenczi says, I am certain if all this proves true, that we shall have to revise certain chapters of the theory of sexuality and genitality. Now, so this is where the problems start really heating up. Ferenczi gives this paper comes off the podium. Freud refuses to shake his hand, and it is never the same. Now Ferenczi is dead within 8 months of pernicious anemia. So just to summarize, so Ferenczi's developmental psychopathology is one where there's a role played by a failure of loving parents, a loving engagement by parents. So the child is, some children do not overcome their death instinct, where insincerity, especially the pretense of infallibility, confuses the child and leads him into a defensive and false development. And then, so you see the beginnings of what, becomes in Winnicott's thinking, the development of the false self. And the confusion of tongues, where the parent responds to the child's tender needs for love with sexual love. And says that, this will result in psychopathology just as a withdrawal of love. So the wrong kind of love or no love. Now, Ferenczi dies, and he's never extruded, but he's exiled, right, in a complicated way. So, after this rift develops, and Ferenczi dies, Freud writes, in a way that's kind of, is tinged with contempt in his obituary for Ferenczi. The conviction was born in him that one could affect far more with one's patients if one gave them enough of the love which they had longed for as children. And Ernest Jones. So Ernest Jones is, in a lot of ways, the power center of psychoanalysis. He is the politician of psychoanalysis. And he's forms the London Psychoanalytic, becomes the British Psychoanalytic. He forms the American Psychoanalytic Society as well. He is, if there's anybody pulling the levers of psychoanalysis, it is Ernest Jones. And he does an absolute hit job. So he's spreading the idea that that Ferenczi's symptoms of pernicious anemia were manifestations of latent psychotic trends, described him as having violent, paranoid, and even homicidal outbursts. And the effect that this has is of saying, that the later stuff that Ferenczi was writing about was invalid. It was all this, it was the product of his unwell mind. Right? He was breaking down, and so he started thinking, that children were being abused and these kinds of things. And so it's kind of put off to the side. And there you will see how other people are taking up this work. They're not talking about Ferenczi. Balint is not talking about Ferenczi. None of these people are really doing that. And it really takes, almost 50 years till he starts to come back. Now, if you think about what Ferenczi's legacy is now, from this perspective, from our perspective, he's highlighting, right, the importance of pre-Oedipal development, the ways that parental presence and sincerity determines safe attachments, and the ways that early injuries make it inaccessible to rational linguistic interventions. He is prefiguring the field of psychosomatics, where these traumas are encoded bodily and are representations of preverbal trauma. He is initiating what is the beginnings of a modern understanding of dissociation. He is introducing us to the beginnings of a two-person psychology, emphasizing the role of empathy, the use of countertransference as data, and the mutual influence of clinician and patient. It's also putting out what looks like the early formula of trauma-informed care, attending to the ways that patients are reshaped around their traumas. These patients have increased requirements for safety in the work that we do, and that clinicians need to be sensitive to the ways that they can participate in re-traumatization. All these things are, of course, very familiar to us. And all of this stuff is like feeds right into relational psychoanalysis. And of course, the relationalists kind of claim Ferenczi in many ways as their, as their main ancestor. So as we get around to the 1980s, it's starting to bubble up, and then the relationalists are like, yeah, this is our guy. Now let's kind of pivot a little bit to Michael Balint, who is the most influential psychoanalyst you've barely heard of. And Balint is he's born also in Budapest. His father was a general practitioner. He started medical school in 1914 as part of a family tradition in medicine. He starts attending Ferenczi's lectures at the urging of his girlfriend. It said that he fell in love with Alice Balint at the same time that he fell in love with psychoanalysis. But before he finished medical school, he was drafted. He went to fight in Russia and Italy. He was injured, carried a partial inability to use his hand for the rest of his life. Returned to Budapest after being injured. He was part of those student protests that got Ferenczi his professorship. He graduated medical school in 1920 at the age of 24, but was part of that initial diaspora. It's getting away from the intense anti-Semitic turn that was happening. In this context, he also inaugurated his name to Balint Mihaly from Maurice Mihaly Bergsman. He converted from Judaism to Unitarianism, entered treatment in Berlin with Hans Sachs, and then returned to Budapest in 1924, where he studied with Ferenczi, had a second analysis. He helped found the Budapest Polyclinic, which became the Budapest Psychoanalytic, and then he became the head of that after Ferenczi's death in 1933 until he was forced into exile. He always had a soft spot for GPs, so he started a group to help GPs understand and cope with the complicated symptoms that were being brought in that were, kind of in this psychosomatic area. Now the Nazis were coming to power. He's part of that diaspora out of Eastern Europe through the effort of Ernest Jones. He wanted to go to Australia, but Australia was putting up some high bars because there was some, they also did not want a lot of Jews in Australia. He had a very rough landing in the UK. First of all, he ended up being placed he wanted to be in London, but he got placed in Manchester. He wasn't as an enemy alien. He was not allowed to leave Manchester. He couldn't go where he wanted. He had to requalify as a physician, so to do his medical training all over again. And shortly after landing in Manchester, his wife died of a ruptured aortic aneurysm. And then towards the end of that, before moving to London or Leicester, he learns that in 1944 that his parents had suicided as the Nazis were rounding the Jews up to ship them off to concentration camps. 1944, he is able to leave, and he relocates to the Tavistock Clinic. Now he's working, again, somewhat in the tradition of Ferenczi, where Freud talks about primary narcissism, right? We're just selfish. We just are, we will drain the mother. If the infant will drain the mother if she can, right? Is ruthless. Balint develops the concept of primary love. He thinks that there is a longing, and again, you see how this goes back to Ferenczi's works on Thalassa. There's a non-sexual pre-ambivalent urge to be in union with the mother. The relationship is not driven by need satisfaction, but by primary harmony, with a desire simply to be with rather than to take from the mother. So, he's basically saying humans are relationally oriented from the very beginning as a primary drive, right? Which again, we see in unfolding developments in the middle school and Bowlby and all of that. He also, in 1968, develops the idea of the basic fault, which is a return to this early developmental injury stuff that Ferenczi is working on, where he talks about how psychopathology emerges from failures or lack of adjustment in the primary love experience. And he says these patients, similar to Ferenczi, though he really is elaborating it, although highly dynamic, force originating from the basic fault has not the form of a conflict. These are not patients whose symptoms are the result of a conflict. There is a hole in these patients. There's a lack, and their symptoms come from that. Their problem is not that they're conflicted about this. There's something they don't have in them. And the cause of this fault is that someone has either failed the patient or defaulted him. And he says, for these patients, you can tell these patients, for these patients, great anxiety surrounds the area, usually expressed as a desperate demand that this time the analyst should not, in fact, must not fail him. So these are patients who are just very worried about how we're going to be, what we're going to miss. It's and react as our, many of our cluster B patients do, as if it is an actual catastrophe when we have missed. So this structural deficit, which is not about conflict or three-person adaptable psychology, is something that happens early in the patient before language, and again is because of how early it is, often inaccessible to language, and often these patients are very often psychosomatic. They bring a lot of symptoms, and so it's how we recognize these patients. I'm just starting my work with the patient I'm starting my work with that I just started with yesterday. I think he falls into that category, perhaps. Now, these patients, to treat these patients, there's a kind of holding and a regression that may be required. So, and he thinks of this as a regression in the service of progression. You have to go back to find a different path out of this spot. And that regression can lead, as Balint says, to a new beginning. And again, like Ferenczi, he's saying, this is not for everybody. So we're not fostering or allowing regression in everybody. There's lots of neurotic patients, higher functioning neurotic patients who don't have such early developmental injuries. And they get psychoanalysis as usual. But these patients who have that basic fault need a different kind of treatment that allows room for that regression. And the analyst is, in this case, has to create a kind of unobtrusive holding. The analyst, he says, must allow his patients to relate to or exist with him as if he were one of the primary substances. This means that he should be willing to carry the patient, not actively, not doing a lot, not actively, but like water carries the swimmer. It's almost invisible in a lot of ways, or like the earth carries the walker. But he must be there, must always be there, and must be indestructible as our water and earth. So requiring a real kind of solidity, a real kind of tolerance for the child to know. And again, you see how like this stuff gets taken up in his peer at the time in the British middle school, Winnicott, and how Winnicott is writing about very similar things: the survival of the object, the use and survival of the object. So in this respect, Balint, along with, and if you look at the timing of the papers, perhaps slightly ahead of Winnicott, is a pioneer in thinking this way. Now, Balint is interesting, and when I say he's the most influential psychoanalyst you've barely heard of, because the other thing he's doing is the work he was doing with GPs is he brings it back when he gets to England. And he writes this book that the doctor, his patient, and the illness, which is in a lot of ways about how these basic fault patients, although he isn't using that language at this time, are bringing that to their primary care doctors through their bodies. And I mean, the relevance to us, I can say I read this book when I was in medical school. We had a doctor-patient class, and I decided I wanted to read this because I was already interested in psychoanalysis. And a couple of years ago, I reread it, and I realized that psychodynamic psychopharmacology is just this, pointed at psychiatrists instead of medical doctors. I had not understood how profoundly it had, this thing I'd read in medical school had basically shaped my academic career. So Balint makes the point that the doctor is the drug. How the doctor is as important as whatever drug is given to the patient. He writes with his third wife, Enid Balint, a paper called "The Possibilities of Patient-Centered Medicine," which we all hear now in the world about patient-centered medicine. That's built into the Affordable Care Act. Balint was the one who introduced this concept into our lexicon. He talked about the overall diagnosis, where he says, in addition to trying to discover a localizable illness or illnesses, the doctor also has to examine the whole person in order to form what we call an overall diagnosis, which becomes a precursor to the psychodynamic formulation. So he's doing all this stuff, which you probably don't know is like harkens back to his work in this book. He talks about 6-minute psychotherapy, right? How the GP can do basic psychotherapeutic interventions that get at the underlying trouble, create a feeling of safety, allow the patient to feel understood enough that they don't have to keep coming at the doctor with a new symptom and a new symptom and a new symptom. And again, it's like psychodynamic psychopharmacology, what we're talking about how we do basic psychodynamic interventions with our psychiatric patients in ways that help them benefit from treatments and not maybe need quite as much treatment as they were needing before. And out of this, he develops the concept of Balint groups, training, which he calls training come research, where primary care doctors are getting together with Balint and really trying to process what is going on, and they're learning about countertransference. And Balint groups are now happening in well over 24 countries around the world. It's in this country. It's the majority of primary care or family practice residencies have Balint groups. It's now required in the UK. And so this is really shaping a lot of stuff that's happening. Now we'll talk about Imre Hermann for a bit, just briefly. So he did not leave Budapest. I guess he was not Jewish, but so he anchored the Budapest School through World War II, the communist dictatorship. He was there continuing to do this work, served as a president of the Hungarian Psychoanalytic Society. Similarly, some of his work was around this 1936 paper, one of the where he expands instinct theory. He posits that there's a primary clinging instinct, again, very differentiating this from Freud, and which has all these relational overtones. And he says this is in every primate we know. You come out, and then there's this wish to cling. Later on, this shows up in the wire mother stuff, where it's a kind of an experimental demonstration that there's a clinging instinct, which is as important, if not more important, than the oral instinct. So he's part of the Hungarian School shifting focus towards a formative role of the mother-child relationship and a different way of understanding object relations as and people as relationally oriented from the beginning, and as one of the precursors in the Hungarian School to what becomes attachment theory, but also part of a dual instinct theory, because he says there's both a clinging instinct but also an instinct to move away, which becomes part of our, the ways we, move out into the world, explore, but also perhaps with the libidinal, like you're in the animal world, one of the reasons that as a primate that you leave your group is again in search of mates. Now he's interesting because one of the things he's doing is he's somebody who's bringing in ethology, mathematics, logic, things that we are learning in neurology and medicine. So he's very actively synthesizing like a lot of the science of the era. So he's a complex, multidisciplinary thinker. And through this, he also starts making contributions to ego psychology. So he's exploring in 1922 how the repetition compulsion develops into a kind of orderly repetition where there's an organizing function, and this is like in the year before Freud's paper that really inaugurates ego psychology comes out. A lot of his research is on, the things that are psychoanalysis and logic, the ego and thinking. He, of course, was also the first psychoanalytic teacher of David Rappaport, who comes here. Now, usually, I think Ernst Chris and Heinz Hartmann in Vienna are credited more with the influence on David Rappaport, but Imre Hermann was another one that shaped that. And then there are the Hungarians not specifically identified with the Hungarian school. So Franz Alexander was an analyst of Ferenczi. Melanie Klein, first analyst of Ferenczi. So they have a front row seat in a way to this way of working. Margaret Mahler started her psychoanalytic training in Budapest with Ferenczi, and then was part of then made the leap to Berlin fairly early on. So she's not really much more identified with the Berlin school. But even here, you see the strains of this. So Melanie Klein is extending Ferenczi's focus on development before the Oedipus complex, is paying attention to the role of the death instinct from birth. Franz Alexander is thinking about healing through corrective emotional experience. And he's also the father of psychosomatics. So he's taking that idea of the focus of the body as a container of unexpressed experience and turning that into this new field of psychosomatics. And then Margaret Mahler, who's theorizing on separation and individuation, reflects Ferenczi's concern with the fragility of the child's emergent subjectivity and the ways that the developmental vulnerability to parental failures and caregiving attunement.